February 6, 1943. The bitter wind howled through the barbed wire fences of Stalag 3B, a prisoner of war camp nestled in the frost-covered forests near Fürstenberg, Germany. Private First Class Robert Thornton of the 369th Infantry Regiment, the famed Harlem Hellfighters, stood at attention as Hauptmann Werner Keller circled him like a predator. The sound of leather boots crunching on frozen gravel punctuated the silence as the German officer's eyes narrowed with suspicion and barely concealed contempt. "Du bist ein Negersoldat?" Keller demanded, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. His voice carried the sharp edge of Nazi racial ideology, dripping with assumptions of inferiority. Thornton's heart pounded against his chest, but his expression remained neutral, a skill honed from years of navigating racial prejudice back home in Harlem. The smell of pine and smoke hung in the air as dozens of other prisoners, white Americans, British and French soldiers, watched the confrontation unfold. Some with concern, others with curiosity, a few with their own ingrained prejudice. "Yes, sir. Private First Class Robert Thornton, United States Army," he replied in perfect measured English. The German captain's eyes widened slightly. His Reichspropaganda had prepared him for an unintelligible, primitive response, not the clear, confident voice of an educated soldier. Keller switched to heavily accented English. "You are educated, you speak proper." The disbelief in his tone revealed volumes about the racial theories that had been hammered into him. "Yes, sir. Graduated high school with honors before I enlisted," Thornton replied, maintaining his dignity despite the degradation of the moment. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides, the only visible sign of the tension coursing through him. Something flickered across Keller's face. Confusion, perhaps, or the first hairline crack in a worldview built on fabricated racial hierarchies. He muttered something in German to the junior officer beside him, who nodded and made a note in a small leather-bound book. "You will teach German officers American language," Keller declared suddenly, more command than request. "Real American, not from books." The other prisoners shifted uncomfortably. Teaching the enemy anything seemed like a betrayal, but Thornton's gaze remained steady as his mind calculated possibilities. In that moment, a plan began to form, one that would use the Germans' own prejudice as a weapon against them. No one in the German command knew that one black soldier's words that morning would not only challenge their deepest racial beliefs, but would ultimately create an underground network of resistance and subversion that would save hundreds of lives and rewrite the story of black POWs in the European theater of war. Robert Thornton was born on July 7, 1922, in a small wooden house on Lenox Avenue in Harlem, New York. The son of William Thornton, a World War I veteran who had served with the 369th Infantry, and Martha Thornton, a seamstress who had migrated from Georgia during the Great Migration. Growing up in the cultural renaissance of Harlem, young Robert absorbed both the vibrant artistic energy of his neighborhood and the harsh realities of American racial segregation. His father often spoke of the paradox of fighting for democracy abroad while being denied its full benefits at home. "We fought for America," William would tell his son, "even when America wasn't fighting for us." These words would echo in Robert's mind throughout his life, shaping his understanding of patriotism and resistance. Robert excelled in school, particularly in languages and literature. His third-grade teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Wilson, recognized his gift early on. "That boy has an ear for language like I've never seen," she told his parents during a parent-teacher conference in 1931. "He picks up accents, phrases, the rhythm of speech. It's remarkable." This natural talent would later prove to be his most powerful weapon in the crucible of war. By the time he graduated from Frederick Douglass High School in 1940, Robert spoke not only flawless English, but had taught himself basic German and French from books borrowed from the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library. He had dreams of becoming a teacher, or perhaps a diplomat, dreams that seemed impossible for a young black man in pre-war America. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Robert, like thousands of other black Americans, felt the call to serve despite the bitter irony of fighting for freedoms abroad that they were denied at home. He enlisted in January 1942, enduring the indignities of a segregated military. "They put us in separate barracks, gave us the worst assignments, acted like we couldn't understand basic instructions," he later wrote in letters home to his mother. But I kept thinking about what Dad always said, that excellence is the best argument against prejudice. During basic training at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, Robert encountered prejudice from both officers and fellow recruits. White officers spoke slowly to him, as if he couldn't comprehend standard English. Training manuals were often simplified for black units, under the assumption that they couldn't grasp complex concepts. Rather than protesting outright, Robert adopted a strategy of quiet competence, outperforming expectations while carefully observing the power structures around him. "It's like a game of chess," he wrote to his childhood friend Marcus Johnson in April 1942. "They expect you to move one way, so you study the board and move another. They never see it coming, because their expectations blind them." His aptitude for languages drew the attention of Captain James Hendricks, one of the few white officers who judged men by their abilities rather than their color. Hendricks recommended Robert for specialized communications training, where he excelled despite the barriers placed before him. "Thornton has an exceptional ability to decode patterns in language and communication," Hendricks noted in his evaluation. "He could be an asset in intelligence operations if given the opportunity." The recommendation was promptly ignored by higher command, and Robert was assigned to the 369th Infantry Regiment, a segregated combat unit with a proud history dating back to World War I. Within the regiment, Robert found brotherhood among men who understood the double burden they carried, fighting both the enemy abroad and prejudice within their own ranks. He befriended Samuel Williams, a former jazz musician from Chicago, Daniel Carter, a farmer's son from rural Georgia, and Marcus King, a college student who had abandoned his studies at Howard University to enlist. "We're making history just by being here," King often said during their late-night conversations in the barracks. "Every time we excel, we're not just winning for ourselves, we're cracking open doors for those who come after us." Robert nodded in agreement, though he had no idea that soon those experiences would be all that stood between prejudice and truth in the heart of Nazi Germany. The European theater of World War II presented a unique paradox for black American soldiers. They were fighting against Nazi Germany, a regime built on theories of racial superiority and the systematic dehumanization of those deemed inferior. Yet they did so within a U.S. military that remained segregated by race and often relegated black troops to service and support roles rather than combat positions. By 1942, approximately 900,000 African Americans were serving in the U.S. Armed Forces, most in segregated units led by white officers. The irony wasn't lost on either the black soldiers or the enemy they faced. Nazi propaganda specifically targeted this contradiction, dropping leaflets near black units that asked, "Why are you fighting for a country that treats you as second-class citizens?" The 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, carried the legacy of their World War I predecessors who had served with distinction under French command. In that earlier conflict, France had awarded the entire regiment the Croix de Guerre for valor, a recognition their own country had been reluctant to match. Private First Class Robert Thornton and his regiment deployed to Europe in late 1942, initially assigned to supply and logistical operations in England, before being moved to frontline duty in Italy and later France. The unit faced not only enemy fire, but also the skepticism of white military leadership, who questioned their combat readiness despite evidence to the contrary. "We're fighting with one hand tied behind our backs," Lieutenant James Carter, one of the few black officers in the regiment, told his men during a briefing in November 1942. "But we'll fight so damn well they can't ignore us." The winter of 1942 to 1943 marked a turning point in the war. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad began to shift momentum against the Axis powers. In North Africa, American and British forces were pushing back Rommel's Afrika Korps. The tide was turning, but the cost in human lives continued to mount on all sides. For the 369th, this shifting tide meant more frequent combat assignments, as manpower needs overcame racial restrictions. During an operation near the Italian front in January 1943, Robert's unit came under heavy fire while securing a strategic crossroads. German artillery pounded their positions for 3 days, causing heavy casualties and cutting off their supply lines. "We were outnumbered 3-1, Samuel Williams later recalled. No food, low on ammo, and half the men wounded. But we held that crossroad because we knew what failure would mean, not just for the mission, but for every black unit waiting for their chance to prove themselves." It was during this engagement that Robert's squad was captured. A German flanking maneuver had isolated their position, and after running out of ammunition and with several men severely wounded, they were forced to surrender. 15 men from the 369th were taken prisoner and marched north, eventually transported to Germany and processed into the POW system. The German POW camp system, known as Stalags, abbreviation for Stammlager or main camps, operated under a complex set of rules that reflected Nazi racial ideology. While the Germans generally adhered to the Geneva Convention regarding the treatment of prisoners from Western Allied nations, they applied these rules unevenly based on race and nationality. Soviet prisoners, for instance, were treated with brutal disregard, with millions dying in captivity. Black American prisoners occupied an uncertain position in this racial hierarchy. Nazi ideology regarded black people as inherently inferior, yet as American servicemen, they were technically entitled to the same treatment as white POWs. This contradiction created a space of tension and possibility that Robert Thornton would eventually exploit. Stalag 3B, where Robert and several of his comrades were interned, housed approximately 3,000 prisoners from various Allied nations. Located about 60 miles southeast of Berlin, the camp was a complex of wooden barracks surrounded by watchtowers and double rows of barbed wire fencing. Prisoners were segregated by nationality, with separate compounds for British, American, French, and other Allied soldiers. Upon arrival, Robert noticed that he and the 4 other black soldiers from his unit were immediately separated from the white American prisoners and placed in a smaller, more isolated barracks. The German camp administration, steeped in racial theories, was uncertain how to categorize them within their worldview. "They didn't know what to do with us," Daniel Carter later wrote. "Their whole system was built on these strict racial categories, but here we were. Americans but black, soldiers but from segregated units. We confused their neat little boxes." This confusion would become the foundation upon which Robert would build his subversive strategy. As February 1943 dawned cold and grey over Stalag 3B, the stage was set for an unexpected battle of wits, one that would pit Nazi racial ideology against the resourcefulness of a Harlem soldier who had spent his entire life navigating systems of prejudice. He had no idea that by the end of that month, his name would be whispered with a mixture of respect and fear throughout the German camp administration, or that his words would become secret weapons in a shadowy war of information and resistance. 3 days after the initial confrontation with Hauptmann Keller, Robert Thornton was escorted to a small office in the camp administration building. The room was sparse but warm, a welcome change from the freezing barracks where he and the other prisoners huddled under thin blankets at night. A coal stove glowed in the corner, and the smell of coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz brew the prisoners received, filled the air. Keller sat behind a desk, along with 2 other German officers, a younger lieutenant named Otto Müller, who served as the camp's translator, and a stern-faced SS Untersturmführer named Heinrich Vogel, whose presence signaled the political importance placed on this unusual arrangement. "Sit," Keller ordered, gesturing to a wooden chair across from the desk. Robert complied, his face betraying nothing of the calculations running through his mind. "You will teach us American English," Müller explained in formal textbook English. "Not what is in books, but how real American soldiers speak. Slang, idioms, pronunciations." He slid a notebook across the desk. "We will meet 3 times each week. You will be given extra rations for cooperation." Robert nodded slowly, aware of the eyes of all 3 Germans studying him for any reaction. "May I ask why?" he ventured. Vogel leaned forward, his SS uniform immaculate. "German intelligence requires authentic American language skills," he said, his English heavily accented but comprehensible. "The books teach one thing, but soldiers speak differently. We need to understand intercepted communications, interrogate prisoners effectively." What went unspoken but hung heavily in the room was the implication that German officers needed to pass as American in covert operations, a violation of the rules of warfare that could result in summary execution if discovered. Robert maintained his composure. "I understand," he said. "When do we begin?" "Now," replied Keller. For the next 2 hours, Robert engaged in what appeared to be a straightforward language lesson. He explained the difference between formal and informal address, demonstrated various American regional accents, and introduced basic military slang. The German officers took meticulous notes, occasionally consulting reference materials when certain terms arose. This phrase, "to be on the ball," what does this mean exactly? Miller asked, his pencil poised above his notebook. "It means to be alert, competent, ready for anything," Robert explained. "A good soldier is on the ball." As the session progressed, Robert carefully began laying the groundwork for what would become an elaborate deception. He introduced slang terms that were slightly outdated or used in contexts that weren't quite accurate. Nothing obvious enough to raise suspicion, but enough to ensure that any German using these phrases would sound slightly off to a native speaker. "We often say, 'That's the berries,' when something is excellent," he told them with a straight face, using a phrase that had been popular in the 1920s but had fallen out of use by the war years. Back in his barracks that evening, Robert whispered his plan to his fellow black POWs, Samuel Williams, Daniel Carter, Marcus King, and James Peterson. They huddled in the corner of their cramped quarters, speaking in hushed tones to avoid the attention of guards or potential informers among other prisoners. "I'm going to teach them wrong, he explained. "Not completely wrong, that would be too obvious. But wrong enough that any German trying to pass as American, using what I teach them, will stand out immediately." "That's playing with fire, Rob," warned Peterson, a former schoolteacher from Philadelphia. "If they catch on—" "They won't," Robert insisted. "Their own prejudice is our protection. They already believe we speak some inferior version of English. They expect us to sound different. I'm just giving them what they expect, but on my terms." Samuel Williams nodded slowly. "It's brilliant, actually. They're so convinced of our inferiority that they won't question what you're teaching them." "Exactly," Robert agreed. "And there's more. I can use these sessions to gather intelligence, observe their routines, listen for information about the war, maybe even plant false information that gets passed up their chain of command." The men discussed the plan late into the night, refining details and contingencies. Each had skills from civilian life that could contribute. Williams had worked as a telephone operator before the war and understood communication systems. Carter had grown up speaking a Southern dialect that included coded language African Americans had developed to communicate around white overseers. King had studied psychology and understood how expectations shaped perception. Over the following weeks, Robert's language sessions with the German officers expanded in scope. More officers began to attend, and Robert was occasionally asked to review transcripts of intercepted communications or help compose documents in authentic American English. Each opportunity was a chance to subtly undermine German intelligence operations. Robert developed a comprehensive system of linguistic sabotage. He taught the Germans that certain common American phrases had specific military meanings. "Weather's been fair" became code for an imminent attack. "Catching a movie tonight" signified troop movements. None of these were actual American codes, but Robert presented them with such conviction that the Germans added them to their intelligence materials. He introduced grammatical structures that were just wrong enough to be noticeable to native speakers, but seemed plausible to non-native learners. He deliberately mispronounced certain military terms and insisted this was how real American soldiers said them. "We always say lieutenant, not lieutenant," he instructed, exaggerating the American pronunciation. "And we never say schedule like the British do with a hesh sound, always schedule. If you say it the British way, everyone will know you're not American." The German officers dutifully recorded these distinctions, unaware that Robert was selectively mixing authentic American usage with subtle misinformation. Their own biases prevented them from questioning why this black soldier's English might differ from what they had previously learned. By March 19th, 1943, Robert had been granted unusual privileges within the camp. He was moved to more comfortable quarters, received better rations, and was allowed limited access to the camp library, ostensibly to reference language materials, but actually providing him opportunities to observe camp operations and communicate with other prisoners. "I'm walking a tight rope," he wrote in a hidden diary he kept sewn into his mattress. "Every day I teach them, I have to remember exactly what I've told them before. One slip, one contradiction, and this all falls apart." The pressure was enormous. Each session required perfect recall of previous lessons and quick thinking to address unexpected questions. Robert developed mnemonic systems to track his fabrications and truths, categorizing information in his mind like an elaborate card catalogue. Meanwhile, word of the unusual arrangement spread through the prisoner grapevine. Initial suspicion from other American POWs, particularly white soldiers, who viewed his apparent preferential treatment with mistrust, gradually shifted to guarded respect as they began to understand the nature of his subversion. Captain Richard Bennett, the highest-ranking American officer in the camp, requested a meeting with Robert in late March. They spoke in hushed tones while walking the perimeter of the exercise yard, where the noise of other prisoners made it difficult for guards to overhear. "What exactly are you doing with these language lessons, Private?" Bennett asked, his tone a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Psychological warfare, sir," Robert replied. "I'm using their prejudice against them." Bennett nodded thoughtfully. "It's risky, if they catch on. With respect, sir, they won't. Their racial theories won't allow them to believe a black soldier could outsmart them." After a moment of consideration, Bennett said, "I want you to coordinate with our escape committee. What you're learning about guard rotations, officer movements, that information is valuable." And so Robert's language lessons evolved into a central component of the camp's resistance network. Information flowed in both directions, Robert feeding false information to the Germans while gathering intelligence on camp operations that helped the prisoners plan escapes, smuggle messages, and maintain morale. As April turned to May, tensions within the camp heightened. News of Allied advances in North Africa reached the prisoners through clandestine radios and cryptic messages from new arrivals. The German officers became increasingly focused on extracting useful intelligence during the language sessions, moving beyond simple language instruction to more targeted questioning. During one session in early May, SS Untersturmführer Vogel placed a map of the eastern United States on the table. "Tell me," he said casually, "about these training camps. Where are they located? What is the typical language used to describe them?" Robert recognized the danger immediately. This was no longer about language. This was direct intelligence gathering. He adopted a slightly confused expression. "Sir, I was trained at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, not on the East Coast. I wouldn't know the specific details of these installations." Vogel's eyes narrowed. "But surely you have heard your fellow soldiers discuss their training. Surely you know the standard terms." Robert carefully navigated the interrogation, providing general information that would be of no tactical value while maintaining his role as a cooperative instructor. Later that night, he warned the escape committee that the Germans were fishing for military intelligence under the guise of language instruction. Lieutenant James Cartwright, a member of the escape committee, shook his head in admiration. "You're playing a dangerous game, Thornton, but damn if you aren't good at it." As spring turned to summer, Robert's influence expanded beyond the immediate circle of German officers he instructed. His carefully crafted misinformation began to appear in German documents, interrogation techniques, and even radio transmissions intercepted by Allied intelligence. He had no way of knowing it then, but his linguistic sabotage was creating ripples that would eventually reach the highest levels of German military intelligence, and ultimately save hundreds of lives on both sides of the conflict. The assumptions revealed a truth no propaganda could hide, that the very prejudice meant to subjugate could become the weapon that undermined an entire system from within. And in the quiet moments before sleep each night, Robert thought of Harlem, of his parents, of the streets where he had grown up navigating a different kind of prejudice. He thought about how language had always been his refuge and his strength. Now, in the heart of the enemy's territory, it had become his most powerful weapon. August 3rd, 1943. The summer heat hung heavy over Stalag 3B as Robert entered the camp commandant's office for what had become a routine language session. But today, something was different. The tension in the room was palpable. Hauptmann Keller paced nervously while Müller shuffled papers with unusual urgency. Only SS Untersturmführer Vogel maintained his typical cold composure. "Sit down, Private Thornton," Vogel said, his voice unnervingly calm. "We have something interesting to discuss today." Robert took his seat, his heart rate accelerating, though he maintained an outward appearance of calm. On the desk lay a folder stamped with the eagle and swastika of official Reich documentation. "We received a most interesting report from Berlin yesterday," Vogel continued, opening the folder with deliberate slowness. "It seems that one of our intelligence officers, who was trained using your language instruction, was captured near Allied lines in Sicily." The room fell silent. Robert kept his expression neutral, though his mind raced through implications and possible responses. "This officer was attempting to pass as an American military policeman," Vogel said. "He had the proper uniform identification, even the correct accent, or so he thought. Do you know what gave him away, Private Thornton?" Robert remained silent. "He used a phrase, 'That's the berries,' to express approval. The Americans who detained him found this curious, as apparently no one has used this expression since the 1920s. Vogel's eyes fixed on Robert's with predatory intensity. "Would you know anything about that?" The moment hung in the balance. Robert's entire deception teetered on the edge of exposure. 5 months of careful manipulation could unravel in an instant. The consequences would be severe, not just for him but for the entire resistance network he had helped build within the camp. "Sir," Robert began carefully, "I explained that some expressions vary by region and generation in America. 'That's the berries' is common where I'm from in Harlem and among older folks. If your officer was trying to pass as someone from another region or a younger person, that might explain the discrepancy." Robert held Vogel's gaze, knowing that his life might depend on this performance. He was leveraging the Germans' own ignorance about American culture and their racial assumptions about the supposedly distinct dialect of Black Americans. Vogel studied him for a long moment before turning to Keller. "What do you think, Hauptmann? Could this explain the failure?" Keller, who had developed a grudging respect for Robert over the months, nodded slowly. "It's possible. American English is notoriously inconsistent across regions. Our intelligence briefings have noted this challenge repeatedly. Perhaps," Müller added, "we should expand our language program to include other American prisoners, to capture these regional variations more accurately." Robert maintained his composure, though internally he recognized both the danger and opportunity in this suggestion. "If I may, sir," he said, addressing Vogel, "I could help develop a more comprehensive program. Perhaps working with different American prisoners to document these regional differences more systematically." Vogel considered this for several moments. "An interesting proposal. We will consider it." He closed the folder. "In the meantime, we will continue our current arrangement. But understand this, Private Thornton. We will be verifying your instruction more carefully from now on." The implication was clear. Robert was now under heightened suspicion. As he left the meeting and walked back to his barracks, escorted by a guard, his mind worked furiously to adapt his strategy to this new reality. That evening, in whispered conversation with his closest confidants, Robert outlined the situation. "They're suspicious, but not certain," he explained. "I've bought us some time, but we need to adjust our approach." "Maybe you should stop," suggested Peterson. "It's getting too dangerous." Robert shook his head. "Now is when it becomes most valuable. They're starting to use what I've taught them in actual field operations. If I can continue to influence their intelligence, the impact could be significant." "What's your plan?" asked Williams. "2 tracks," Robert replied. "First, I'll introduce a more complex system of regional and demographic variations in American English, basically creating a linguistic maze so confusing that they can never be sure what's authentic. Second, we use their new verification process to feed them information we want them to verify, creating opportunities to observe their intelligence channels. Over the next several weeks, Robert implemented this new strategy with meticulous care. He developed elaborate charts showing supposed regional variations in American military slang. He created fictional distinctions between the language used by different branches of service, different ranks, even different ethnic groups within the American military. The Germans, with their love of systematic categorization, embraced this approach. They devoted increased resources to documenting these variations, unwittingly spreading Robert's misinformation deeper into their intelligence apparatus. By September 1943, Robert's linguistic sabotage had expanded beyond Stalag 3B. German intelligence offices in Berlin began distributing language guides based on his instruction to field operatives and interrogators throughout the European theater. What had begun as a small-scale deception was now undermining German intelligence operations across multiple fronts. Meanwhile, the Allied advance continued. Italy surrendered on September 8th, though German forces would continue to fight on Italian soil. The Eastern Front pushed westward as Soviet forces reclaimed territory. In the Pacific, American forces advanced island by island toward Japan. The tide of the war was turning, and information, accurate information, was becoming increasingly crucial to both sides. Within Stalag 3B, Robert's status continued to evolve. The initial suspicion following the Sicily incident had gradually transformed into a strange kind of respect. The German officers, while still viewing him through the lens of their racist ideology, nevertheless recognized his intelligence and expertise. This cognitive dissonance created opportunities that Robert exploited ruthlessly. "They can't reconcile what their ideology tells them about my capabilities with what they observe directly," he explained to Captain Bennett during one of their clandestine meetings. "That gap between their theory and their experience, that's where I operate." Bennett nodded thoughtfully. "You're not just feeding them bad information, are you? You're challenging their entire worldview." Robert hadn't thought about it in those terms, but Bennett was right. Every successful deception, every piece of misinformation that the Germans accepted from him was a small crack in the foundation of their racial theories. The implications extended far beyond tactical advantage. In October 1943, an opportunity arose that would test the full extent of Robert's influence. A group of high-ranking intelligence officers from Berlin visited Stalag 3B to observe the language program firsthand. Among them was Obersturmbannführer Klaus Richter, a senior officer in the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the intelligence agency of the SS. Richter was developing a specialized infiltration unit, German soldiers who could pass as American to gather intelligence or conduct sabotage behind Allied lines. Robert was instructed to conduct a demonstration lesson for this delegation. The session took place in the camp commandant's office, which had been rearranged for the occasion. 9 German officers of varying ranks sat in a semicircle, watching as Robert explained the nuances of American military communication. "American soldiers rarely use official terminology in casual conversation," he explained, moving with confidence around the room. "Instead, they develop abbreviated forms or slang terms. For example, a battalion commander might officially be referred to as Lieutenant Colonel, but in casual conversation among troops, you would hear the old man or simply the CO. The officers nodded and took notes. Robert continued, introducing a series of fabricated slang terms and recognition signals that he claimed were universal among American troops. With each new piece of misinformation, he was potentially saving Allied lives, ensuring that any German attempting to pass as American using these false signals would be quickly identified. Richter, who had been watching silently, finally spoke. "Impressive," he said in nearly flawless English. "But tell me, Private Thornton, how do these terms vary between white and Negro troops? Surely there must be differences." The question was a trap, an attempt to catch Robert in a contradiction or force him to admit the limitations of his knowledge. Robert recognized the danger immediately, but he also saw opportunity. "An excellent question, Herr Obersturmbannführer," he replied. "There are indeed variations, but perhaps not in the way you might expect." He proceeded to outline a complex system of linguistic differences that played directly into Nazi racial theories while actually being completely fabricated. "White troops from rural areas tend to use more abbreviated forms," he explained. "They might say Sarge instead of Sergeant. Negro troops, particularly those from urban areas like myself, Often use more formal language in military contexts, a habit developed to counter prejudice in civilian life. This was complete fiction, but it aligned with Nazi preconceptions about racial characteristics while providing a plausible explanation for any inconsistencies they might observe. More importantly, it reinforced the idea that black soldiers like Robert would use more formal, proper English, justifying the formal language he had been teaching them all along. Richter nodded with satisfaction, his racial biases confirmed even as he was being deceived. "This matches our understanding of racial psychology," he remarked to the other officers. "The Negro attempts to imitate proper language but lacks the natural intuition of the white American." Robert maintained his neutral expression, though inwardly he felt both disgust at Richter's racism and satisfaction at how perfectly the German had fallen into his trap. The session continued for another hour, with Robert introducing increasingly elaborate fabrications that the Germans eagerly documented. After the delegation departed, Hauptmann Keller approached Robert as he was being escorted back to his barracks. "You impressed them," he said, lighting a cigarette. "Richter wants to expand the program. He's requested that you prepare comprehensive documentation of American military slang for distribution to intelligence units." This was beyond anything Robert had anticipated. A direct channel to influence German intelligence operations at a systemic level. The potential impact was enormous, but so was the risk. Creating written documentation would require even more careful planning to avoid contradictions or exposure. "I would be honored to assist in any way I can, Herr Hauptmann," Robert replied with carefully measured enthusiasm. That night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, Robert stared at the wooden slats of the bunk above him. The scope of his deception had grown far beyond his original intent. What had begun as a small act of resistance had evolved into something that could potentially save hundreds, even thousands of lives. But the pressure was mounting. Each expansion of his influence brought new scrutiny, new risks. The constant performance, maintaining his facade of cooperation while carefully measuring every word, every piece of information he provided, was taking its toll. "Are you awake?" Williams whispered from the adjacent bunk. "Yeah," Robert replied softly. "I overheard some guards talking today. Allied forces are pushing through Italy. They think Rome might fall by Christmas." Robert absorbed this information silently. The war was progressing. Liberation might come eventually, but not soon enough. In the meantime, his linguistic battle continued, a silent, invisible front in a war fought not just with guns and tanks, but with words and perceptions. "We're going to make it," Williams said, as much to himself as to Robert. "All this, it matters. What you're doing matters." Robert nodded in the darkness, though Williams couldn't see him. "I know," he said finally. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's another day of making the Germans believe exactly what we want them to believe." As autumn deepened into winter, what happened next shattered 400 years of prejudice in ways that would not be fully understood until long after the war had ended. November 20th, 1943. The first snow of winter dusted the grounds of Stalag 3B as Robert Thornton sat at a desk in a small room adjacent to the camp administration building. Spread before him were dozens of handwritten pages, the culmination of months of careful deception, now being compiled into what the Germans called the Amerikanische Militärsprache Handbuch, American Military Language Handbook. His fingers were stiff with cold as he methodically organized his notes into sections: general military terminology, regional variations, rank-specific usage, and recognition signals. Each page contained a mixture of authentic American military language and carefully crafted misinformation, the real and the false interwoven so seamlessly that only a native speaker would recognize the discrepancies. The door opened, and Hauptmann Keller entered, stamping snow from his boots. "How is the work progressing, Thornton?" he asked, moving to stand behind Robert and examine the pages. "Nearly complete, Herr Hauptmann," Robert replied. "I'm just finalizing the section on recognition signals." Keller nodded with satisfaction. "Excellent. Obersturmbannführer Richter will be pleased. The first copies will be distributed to field operatives next week." The gravity of this statement wasn't lost on Robert. His fabricated language guide would soon be in the hands of German spies and infiltrators throughout Europe. The potential impact was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I hope it meets your expectations, sir," Robert said carefully. Keller studied him for a moment. "You know, Thornton, when you first arrived, I had certain preconceptions about Negro soldiers. Your people were not supposed to be capable of this level of intellectual work." He gestured to the meticulously organized pages. "And yet, here we are." Robert maintained his neutral expression, despite the condescension underlying the supposed compliment. "We're full of surprises, sir." "Indeed." Keller lit a cigarette and leaned against the wall. "Tell me something, Thornton. In America, would a man like you, with your obvious intelligence, have opportunities? Could you become an officer, perhaps, or a professor?" The question caught Robert off guard. It was the first time any of the German officers had expressed interest in his life beyond what was useful to their immediate objectives. He considered his response carefully, aware that this might be another test. "The opportunities are limited, sir," he replied truthfully. "There are barriers, but things are changing. The war itself is changing things." Keller nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. Our propaganda tells us that America's treatment of your people proves they don't truly believe in the democracy they claim to fight for." He blew a stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "Perhaps there is some truth to that." "Every nation has its contradictions, Herr Hauptmann," Robert said diplomatically, "including Germany." A flash of something, perhaps recognition, perhaps wariness, crossed Keller's face. "Finish your work, Thornton. I'll return in 1 hour." After Keller left, Robert returned to his task with renewed focus. The conversation had revealed something important. The German officer was beginning to see him as a human being, not just a racial category. This shift created both opportunity and danger. The more Keller recognized Robert's humanity and intelligence, the more he might question the effectiveness of the language program and potentially uncover the deception. Later that evening, as Robert shared the development with his circle of confidants in their barracks, opinions were divided. "This is dangerous," Peterson warned. "If they start questioning their assumptions about us, they might start questioning everything you've taught them." "Or it might work in our favor," countered King. "If they see Robert as exceptional, as different from their stereotype of Negroes, they might attribute any inconsistencies to their own misunderstanding of American culture, rather than to deliberate deception." Robert considered both perspectives. "For now, I need to maintain the balance, to seem cooperative and useful without encouraging too much scrutiny. The handbook is nearly complete. Once it's distributed, the damage to their intelligence operations will be done regardless of what happens to me." The following morning, Robert was completing the final pages of the handbook when an unusual commotion disrupted the camp's routine. Trucks arrived carrying dozens of new prisoners, American airmen shot down during the increasingly intensive bombing campaigns over Germany. Among them was Second Lieutenant Michael Dawson, a navigator from a B-17 crew. During the evening roll call, Robert noticed Dawson standing in the American section, his uniform still relatively clean, his face showing the bewilderment of recent capture. Through the prisoner grapevine, Robert learned that Dawson's bomber had been shot down 3 days earlier during a raid on industrial targets in the Ruhr Valley. The arrival of new prisoners always brought both opportunity and risk, fresh intelligence about the progress of the war, but also potential disruption to established routines and resistance networks. Robert knew he needed to make contact with Dawson to brief him on the language deception before the Germans might question him, but access between different sections of the camp was limited. Opportunity came the next day when Robert was escorted to the administration building to deliver the completed handbook. As he crossed the yard, he spotted Dawson being led to the delousing station, a standard procedure for new arrivals. Making a split-second decision, Robert pretended to stumble, dropping the pages of the handbook which scattered in the light breeze. "Clumsy swine!" shouted the guard, shoving Robert as he scrambled to collect the papers. In the momentary confusion, Robert managed to position himself near Dawson. "American Slang Handbook," he whispered urgently as he gathered pages near Dawson's feet. "They'll ask you. Everything I've taught them is wrong. Play along." Dawson's eyes widened slightly, but he gave an almost imperceptible nod before being pushed forward by his guard. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to prevent Dawson from inadvertently exposing the deception during interrogation. Robert delivered the completed handbook to Hauptmann Keller, who received it with evident satisfaction. "Excellent work, Thornton," he said, flipping through the pages. "This will be of great value to the Reich." "If only you knew," Robert thought behind his neutral expression. "There is one final matter," Keller continued. "Obersturmbannführer Richter has requested a practical demonstration of the handbook's effectiveness. Tomorrow, you will conduct an evaluation session with one of the newly arrived prisoners to verify the accuracy of your work." Robert's heart sank. This was exactly the scenario he had feared. "Of course, Herr Hauptmann, I would be happy to demonstrate the material's accuracy." That night was one of the longest of Robert's captivity. He lay awake in his bunk, mind racing through possible scenarios for the next day's evaluation. If the prisoner selected was Dawson, and if his whispered warning had been understood and heeded, there was a chance the deception could continue. If not, the consequences would be severe, not just for Robert but for everyone connected to the resistance network he had helped build. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he told Williams in the darkness, "make sure the escape committee knows about the handbook. Even if I'm exposed, they need to get word to Allied intelligence about what information the Germans are working with." Morning came too quickly. After roll call, Robert was escorted to a small room in the administration building that had been set up for the evaluation. Keller was already there, along with Müller, Vogel and, to Robert's dismay, Obersturmbannführer Richter himself, who had apparently returned to observe this crucial test. "Ah, Private Thornton," Richter greeted him with cold civility. "Your handbook has generated considerable interest in Berlin. Today we will see if it performs as promised." The door opened again, and guards escorted in the prisoner for evaluation. Robert's heart froze. It wasn't Dawson, but another of the newly arrived airmen, a young sergeant he didn't recognize. Their brief eye contact revealed no recognition, no awareness of the precarious situation they both now faced. "Sergeant James Cooper, U.S. Army Air Forces," Richter announced, reading from a file. "Shot down over Dusseldorf 4 days ago. He will serve as our test subject." Cooper stood at attention, his expression wary but defiant. He showed no signs of serious injury, though a bandage was visible beneath his collar. "The procedure is simple," Richter explained to the room. "Hauptmann Keller will use recognition phrases from the handbook. If Private Thornton's work is accurate, Sergeant Cooper should respond in the predicted manner." Robert maintained his composure through sheer force of will. Everything now depended on Cooper, a man who had no idea that his natural reactions could expose a months-long deception and endanger dozens of lives. Keller opened the handbook to a marked page and cleared his throat. "So, Sergeant Cooper," he began in his accented English, "I hear the eagle flies on Friday." This was one of the fabricated recognition phrases Robert had included, supposedly a common expression among American servicemen referring to payday, but actually completely invented. Cooper's brow furrowed slightly. "Sir?" Keller glanced at Robert, then back at Cooper. "You know, the eagle flies on Friday, that's the berries, right?" Cooper's confusion was evident. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't understand what you're asking me." An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Richter's eyes narrowed as he looked from Cooper to Robert. "It seems your American colleague is not familiar with these phrases, Private Thornton." Robert's mind raced. This was the moment of crisis, the point where months of careful deception could unravel in an instant. But in that crisis, he found clarity. The very prejudice that had shaped his entire experience as a black man in America and as a prisoner in Germany now offered an unexpected lifeline. "Sergeant Cooper is from the Army Air Forces, sir," Robert explained calmly. "As I noted in Section 3 of the handbook, Air Forces personnel use different slang than ground forces. Additionally," he continued, nodding toward Cooper, "from his accent, I believe the sergeant is from the Midwest, Minnesota perhaps, where certain expressions are less common." Cooper, though clearly still confused, seemed to sense the importance of the moment. "That's right, sir. St. Paul, Minnesota." Richter frowned, flipping through the handbook. I see you've noted regional variations, but this particular phrase was listed as universal military usage. With respect, sir, Robert replied, his heart pounding but his voice steady. There's a footnote on page 27 explaining that universal in American military context still allows for branch-specific exceptions, particularly for the Army Air Forces, which has developed its own distinct culture. Keller quickly turned to the page in question, where Robert had indeed included such a footnote, a precautionary measure that now proved vital. He's correct, Keller confirmed, showing the page to Richter. It's noted here. Richter's expression remained skeptical. Then perhaps we should try some Air Force's specific terminology. He took the handbook from Keller and flipped through it purposefully. According to your notes, Private Thornton, bomber crews commonly use the phrase cooking with gas to indicate a successful mission. Is this familiar to you, Sergeant Cooper? This was another of Robert's fabrications, though less obviously false than some others. Cooper hesitated, and Robert held his breath. We sometimes use that expression, sir, Cooper said carefully, though in my squadron we more often said a mission was in the bag. Before Richter could pursue this discrepancy, Robert interjected. As noted in the section on squadron-specific variations, sir, different bomber groups develop their own unique expressions. The handbook couldn't possibly document every variation. It focuses on the most common terms across multiple units. A tense silence followed as Richter studied both prisoners. Robert maintained an expression of helpful deference, while Cooper seemed to have intuited the need to neither fully confirm nor completely deny the fabricated terminology. Finally, Richter closed the handbook with a sharp snap. It seems American military language is even more inconsistent than we anticipated, he said with evident frustration. This complicates our intelligence work considerably. Which is precisely why the handbook emphasizes recognition through multiple signals rather than relying on any single phrase, Robert pointed out. As I explained to Hauptmann Keller, American English is constantly evolving, especially in wartime. New expressions emerge weekly. Keller nodded. Private Thornton has been most insistent on this point, Herr Obersturmbannführer. It is one of the challenges of working with American subjects. Richter's cold gaze shifted between the prisoners and the German officers. For a moment, Robert thought he detected suspicion, but then the SS officer merely nodded. Continue the evaluation with the recognition gestures section. I want to observe the physical signals as well. The session continued for another hour, with Keller demonstrating various hand signals and physical gestures that Robert had included in the handbook. Some were genuine American military signals, others subtly modified to be incorrect. Cooper, through either intuition or careful observation of Robert's subtle cues, managed to navigate the evaluation without exposing the deception, expressing recognition of the authentic signals while showing plausible uncertainty about the fabricated ones. When the evaluation finally concluded, Richter seemed satisfied, if not entirely convinced. The handbook will require ongoing updates, he declared, but it provides a solid foundation. We will proceed with distribution to field units as planned. As Cooper was escorted back to the prisoner barracks, he gave Robert a quick glance that communicated both confusion and a dawning understanding. Robert knew he would need to get word to Cooper as soon as possible to explain the full situation and ensure his continued cooperation. You've done valuable work for the Reich, Private Thornton, Richter said as he prepared to leave. Perhaps your race possesses more linguistic aptitude than our scientists previously believed. The statement was delivered as if it were a generous concession rather than the backhanded compliment it actually was. Thank you, sir, Robert replied with practiced humility. I'm pleased to have been of service. That evening, through the camp's prisoner network, Robert managed to pass a message to Cooper, explaining the nature and purpose of the language deception. Cooper's reply came back through the same channels. Understood. Clever. Count me in. With Cooper's cooperation secured and the handbook now being distributed to German intelligence units, Robert's linguistic sabotage entered a new phase. His fabricated American slang and recognition signals would now influence German operations far beyond the confines of Stalag 3B. December arrived with bitter cold, and the news of continued Allied advances in Italy and the Soviet Union. The mood among the German guards darkened as reports of bombing raids on German cities increased. Civilian casualties were mounting, and many of the guards had families in targeted areas. On December 12, 1943, Robert was summoned to Hauptmann Keller's office. The German officer looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that manifested in the constant tapping of his fingers on the desk. "My family is in Hamburg," he said without preamble. "The bombing there, it is very bad." Robert nodded silently, unsure how to respond to this unexpected personal disclosure. "I received this yesterday," Keller continued, pushing a folded piece of paper across the desk. It was a telegram reporting that his brother's family had been killed in a recent air raid. "I'm sorry for your loss, Herr Hauptmann," Robert said quietly, genuinely moved, despite his enmity toward what Keller represented. Keller studied him with reddened eyes. "You know, Thornton, I have been thinking about what you said, about nations having their contradictions. Germany, America." He gestured vaguely. "This war. Sometimes I wonder what it is all for." It was a startling admission from a German officer, particularly with an SS presence in the camp. Such defeatist talk could have serious consequences for Keller if reported. "War brings suffering to everyone it touches, sir," Robert replied carefully. "Yes." Keller was silent for a moment, then seemed to collect himself. "The reason I called you here, Berlin has requested your transfer to a special facility. Your language work has impressed Obersturmbannführer Richter. He believes you could be more valuable in a centralized intelligence operation." The news sent a chill through Robert. Removal from the camp would separate him from his support network and place him under even greater scrutiny. Moreover, it would mean the end of his ability to communicate with the prisoner resistance. "When would this transfer occur?" he asked, working to keep his voice neutral. 3 days from now," Keller replied. "A special transport is being arranged." He hesitated, then added, "It would be an unusual position for a prisoner of your background. Better conditions, certainly, but also greater expectations." Robert understood the implicit message. The new assignment would come with increased privileges, but also increased danger. Failure or exposure would have immediate and severe consequences. "I am honored by the recognition, Herr Hauptmann," he said, maintaining his role as the cooperative prisoner. "I look forward to continuing my work in the new facility." Keller nodded, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by Robert's apparent enthusiasm. "You are dismissed. Return to your barracks and prepare for transfer. You will be allowed to take your personal items." That night, in the darkness of the barracks, Robert held an urgent council with his closest Confederates. 3 days, he whispered. "Once I'm transferred, our network loses its access to German intelligence operations. Can you escape?" Williams asked. Robert shook his head. "Too risky, and it would alert them to the possibility that the entire language program was compromised. No, I need to go through with the transfer, but first we need to maximize the damage to their intelligence system." "How?" asked Peterson. "The handbook is already in circulation, but I can add one final layer of sabotage," Robert explained. "Tomorrow, I'll request a meeting with Keller to provide critical updates to the handbook, emergency recognition signals that I claim have just come into use among American forces. And these signals will be," prompted King. "Designed to create maximum confusion," Robert replied. "Signals that directly contradict established German protocols, phrases that mimic German operational language, but with opposite meanings. If they incorporate these into their field operations, it will create chaos in their communication systems." The men discussed the details late into the night, refining the plan and preparing for various contingencies. The stakes were enormous, not just for Robert's personal safety, but for the broader war effort. Every German operation disrupted by his linguistic sabotage potentially meant Allied lives saved. The next morning, Robert requested his meeting with Keller and was granted an immediate audience. The German officer appeared even more fatigued than the day before, his uniform slightly rumpled, a notable departure from his usual meticulous appearance. "What is it, Thornton?" he asked wearily. "I have preparations to make for your transfer." Sir, I've received information from the new prisoners about emergency recognition signals that have recently been implemented among American forces, Robert explained. I believe these should be included in the handbook before my departure. Keller's interest was piqued, despite his exhaustion. What sort of signals? Primarily auditory and visual cues for covert operations, Robert replied. Designed specifically for identifying friendly forces in civilian areas or behind enemy lines. Over the next hour, Robert outlined an elaborate system of fabricated signals, hand gestures, verbal exchanges, and visual markers, all carefully designed to interfere with German intelligence operations. He described how American agents would supposedly use specific patterns of tapping to identify themselves, certain casual phrases that contained coded meanings, and particular ways of wearing civilian clothing that signaled their allegiance. Each element of this system was crafted to create maximum disruption if implemented by German operatives. The hand signals resembled common German military gestures, but with subtle differences that would create confusion in the field. The verbal exchanges included phrases that sounded innocuous but would immediately alert any actual American to potential deception. Keller documented everything meticulously, occasionally asking for clarification or repetition. When the session concluded, he gathered his notes and stood. This is valuable information, Thornton. I will ensure it reaches Berlin today before your transfer. He hesitated, then added, Your cooperation has been noteworthy. It will be mentioned in my final report. Robert maintained his deferential demeanor. Thank you, sir. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be of service. As he was escorted back to his barracks, Robert felt a complex mixture of emotions. Fear about his imminent transfer, satisfaction at having planted one final piece of misinformation, and a growing uncertainty about Hauptmann Keller, whose behavior had become increasingly unpredictable. Back in the barracks, Williams had news of his own. Word from the underground network, he whispered. The Allies landed more forces in Italy. Rome might fall soon, and there are rumors of another major invasion being planned for next year, somewhere in northern France. The news brought both hope and frustration. The war was progressing toward an Allied victory, but not quickly enough to prevent Robert's transfer. In 3 days, he would be removed from Stalag 3B to an unknown facility, where he would face new challenges and dangers. The following day passed in tense preparation. Through the prisoner network, Robert circulated as much information as possible about his language deception, ensuring that others could continue to exploit the Germans' compromised intelligence if opportunities arose. He memorized names, dates, and details that might prove valuable to Allied intelligence if he ever managed to return to American forces. On December 14th, his final full day at Stalag 3B, an unexpected development occurred. During the evening roll call, as prisoners stood in formation in the biting cold, the camp commandant made a rare appearance to announce that a special inspection would take place the following morning, coinciding with Robert's scheduled transfer. Senior officers from Berlin will be evaluating camp operations, the commandant declared. All prisoners will remain in barracks until the inspection is complete. Later, through guards sympathetic to prisoners who had treated them humanely, rumors circulated that the inspection was actually focused on suspected security breaches within the German staff. The SS was investigating possible information leaks from the camp to resistance networks. This development added a new layer of danger to Robert's final hours at Stalag 3B. If the SS investigation uncovered any hint of his deception before his transfer, the consequences would be immediate and severe. That night, as Robert lay awake, preparing mentally for whatever the next day might bring, he was startled by the sound of his barracks door quietly opening. A flashlight beam swept briefly across the room, and a voice whispered, "Thornton, come," quickly and silently. Robert rose cautiously from his bunk to find Hauptmann Keller standing in the doorway, alone and without the usual guard escort. This unprecedented breach of protocol set alarm bells ringing in Robert's mind, but he had little choice but to comply. Once outside, Keller led him not toward the administration building, but toward a seldom-used storage shed near the camp perimeter. Inside, illuminated by a single lantern, was a small table with papers spread across it. Robert's confusion turned to shock when he recognized what they were: copies of his language handbook with sections highlighted and annotated. "I'm not a fool, Thornton," Keller said quietly, his voice a mixture of anger and something else, perhaps respect. 2 days ago, we captured a German deserter trying to cross into Switzerland. Under interrogation, he revealed that he had been trained as an infiltrator using a special language guide for American English. Keller tapped the handbook. This guide. He was caught because he used phrases that immediately identified him as a fraud, phrases you taught us. Robert maintained his composure with supreme effort. "Sir, save it," Keller interrupted. "I've been reviewing everything you've provided us, testing it against other sources. The inconsistencies are too numerous once one begins to look for them." His eyes held Robert's. "You've been systematically sabotaging our intelligence operations for months." There seemed no point in denial. Robert straightened his posture, prepared for whatever would come next. "Yes, sir." To his astonishment, Keller didn't call for guards or reach for his sidearm. Instead, he gave a short, bitter laugh. "It was brilliantly executed. You exploited our preconceptions perfectly. We believed ourselves superior, so we never questioned that a Negro prisoner might be manipulating us." "That was the general idea, sir," Robert acknowledged cautiously. Keller was silent for a moment, studying him. "The SS inspection tomorrow is specifically investigating the language program. Richter has come under scrutiny after several failed operations. They will discover the deception, and they will execute you. After interrogation methods I would not wish on anyone." Robert's mind raced. Why was Keller telling him this? Was this some elaborate psychological tactic? As if reading his thoughts, Keller continued, "My brother who died in Hamburg, he had questions about the Reich, about its methods. Before his death, he wrote to me about atrocities he had witnessed on the Eastern Front. Things that—" He trailed off, then seemed to refocus. "The war is lost. Perhaps not this month or next. But Germany cannot prevail. I've known this for some time." He picked up a folder from the table. "These are transfer papers authorizing your movement to a labor detail at a farm 20 kilometers from here. The farmer is a relative of mine who has no love for the Nazi regime. From there, arrangements can be made to move you toward Allied lines in the west." Robert stared in disbelief. "Why would you do this?" Keller's expression hardened. "I'm not doing it for you specifically. I'm doing it because what you represent contradicts everything the Reich has taught about racial hierarchy. Your intelligence, your courage, they are inconvenient facts for a system built on lies." He pushed the papers toward Robert. "And perhaps I am doing it for my brother, who would have wanted me to finally take a stand, however small." The enormity of the moment washed over Robert. This German officer was risking his life to help him escape, not just from the camp, but from certain torture and execution. It was a gesture that defied simple categorization of friend and enemy, of good and evil. "There is a guard at the West Gate who will be expecting these papers at 4:30 tomorrow morning," Keller explained. "You have memorized the map of the local area from your time in my office, yes? I've seen you studying it when you thought I wasn't looking." Robert nodded. It was true. He had mentally recorded every detail of maps he had access to during his months of language instruction. "Good. The farm is here." Keller indicated a position on a small map included with the papers. "My cousin will be expecting you. After that, you are on your own." He checked his watch. "You have 6 hours. Return to your barracks now and collect anything essential. Make no obvious preparations that might alert others." As Robert turned to leave, Keller added, "One more thing, Thornton. When this war ends and you tell your story, if you choose to tell it, remember that not every German was a Nazi. Some of us were simply trapped in a system we came to despise." "I'll remember, Herr Hauptmann," Robert promised. 6 hours later, as the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Robert Thornton presented falsified transfer papers to a nervous guard at the west gate of Stalag 3B. The guard examined them briefly, compared them to a list in his possession, and then, with a quick glance around to ensure they weren't observed, opened the small side gate. "Schnell," he whispered urgently. "Quickly." Robert stepped through the gate and, for the first time in 10 months, stood outside the confines of the prison camp. The cold air felt different somehow, sharper, fresher, filled with possibility. Without looking back, he began walking west along the road indicated in Keller's instructions, his pace measured and purposeful, as if he were simply a laborer heading to an early morning assignment. As Stalag 3B receded behind him, he reflected on the strange twist of fate that had led to this moment. His captor's prejudice had first created the opportunity for his deception, and then, through its gradual erosion in the mind of one German officer, created the opportunity for his escape. The irony was profound. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable stories of World War II, a story of how words became weapons, how prejudice became its own undoing, and how one man's understanding of the power of language helped undermine an entire system of oppression. Robert Thornton's journey from that cold German road to eventual freedom would be arduous and dangerous. He would spend 2 months with the German underground, moving from safe house to safe house, before finally crossing into Allied territory in March 1944. Along the way, he would gather intelligence on German positions, troop movements, and defense preparations that proved invaluable to Allied planners. But perhaps most significantly, the linguistic sabotage he had orchestrated continued to disrupt German operations long after his escape. The fabricated slang and recognition signals he had created had been distributed throughout the German intelligence apparatus, compromising numerous operations and potentially saving hundreds of Allied lives. German attempts to infiltrate American lines using his false language guide led to the capture of at least 17 agents, according to post-war records. Upon his return to Allied forces, Robert provided detailed information about the handbook and its contents, allowing counterintelligence officers to recognize and capture German agents attempting to use the compromised signals. This intelligence coup remained classified until 1967, more than 2 decades after the war's end. As for Hauptmann Werner Keller, he survived the war but was captured by Soviet forces during the fall of Berlin in 1945. He spent 8 years in a Soviet labor camp before being repatriated to East Germany in 1953. In a strange twist of fate, he would later emigrate to the United States during a brief thaw in Cold War relations, settling in Minnesota, where he taught German at a small college until his death in 1972. Robert Thornton returned to Harlem after the war, using the GI Bill to complete a degree in linguistics at Columbia University. He went on to become a professor, specializing in the study of how language shapes perception and reinforces or challenges social hierarchies. His academic work, though seemingly removed from his wartime experience, was profoundly influenced by the lessons he had learned about the power of words to either enslave or liberate. In 1948, he married Elaine Davis, a librarian he met during his studies. They raised 3 children, all of whom would go on to careers in education or public service. Though he rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, he maintained correspondence with several of his fellow POWs from Stalag 3B, including Samuel Williams, who became a lifelong friend. It wasn't until 1967, when classified records about the Thornton deception were finally declassified, that the full extent of his contribution to the war effort became known. A profile in the New York Times brought his story to public attention, and he was belatedly awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. The citation read, in part, "Private First Class Robert Thornton displayed extraordinary courage and ingenuity while in enemy captivity, conducting a sophisticated campaign of linguistic counterintelligence that significantly undermined enemy operations and saved countless Allied lives. His actions represent the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, the 369th Infantry Regiment, and the United States Army." When asked by a reporter how he had managed to maintain his deception for so long, Thornton replied with characteristic thoughtfulness, "I simply used their prejudice against them. They believed certain things about me because of my race, things that weren't true but that they needed to believe to maintain their worldview. I just worked within those assumptions while quietly undermining them." The reporter pressed further. "Weren't you afraid they would discover what you were doing?" "Of course I was afraid," Thornton acknowledged, "every day. But I was more afraid of missing the opportunity to fight back in whatever way I could. When you're a prisoner, your options are limited. Language was my weapon, the only one available to me. In 1975, 32 years after his time in Stalag 3B, Robert Thornton received an unexpected letter from East Germany. It was from Hauptmann Keller's daughter, who had discovered her father's wartime diaries after his death. In them, Keller had written about the black American prisoner who had changed his understanding of race and humanity. "My father wrote that meeting you was the beginning of his liberation from the ideology he had been raised in," she wrote. "He said that in helping you escape, he found a part of himself he thought had been lost forever. I wanted you to know that your impact extended beyond military considerations. You helped save one man's soul." Thornton kept this letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his life, occasionally taking it out and rereading it during difficult times. It represented to him the most profound victory of his war experience, not the disruption of enemy operations, but the transformation of one human heart. In later years, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, Thornton became a respected voice on issues of racial equality and human dignity. He often drew parallels between his wartime experiences and ongoing struggles for justice. "The most dangerous prison is not made of barbed wire and guard towers," he would tell his students. "It's made of false ideas, about others, about ourselves, about what's possible. My time in Stalag 3B taught me that these prisons of the mind can be escaped, just like physical ones. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see beyond the barriers others have built." Robert Thornton passed away peacefully in his Harlem home on October 12, 1998, at the age of 76. His obituary in the New York Times described him as a warrior of words who turned language itself into a battlefield and helped change the course of history. His story remains one of the most remarkable examples of psychological warfare in World War II, a testament to the power of intelligence, courage, and the human capacity to resist oppression even in the most challenging circumstances. Today, in the special collections of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. TWU, visitors can view a single, weathered page from the original Amerikanische Militärsprache Handbuch, the falsified language guide that Thornton created during his captivity. Next to it is a simple placard that reads, "Words are weapons too. With these, one man fought back." The legacy of Robert Thornton and the other black servicemen who served with distinction despite facing prejudice both at home and abroad continues to challenge us to examine our own assumptions and biases. Their stories remind us that heroism comes in many forms, sometimes in dramatic acts of physical courage, but often in quieter, sustained acts of moral and intellectual resistance. As Thornton himself once wrote in a letter to a former student, "The greatest victory against prejudice isn't winning an argument or even changing a law. It's changing how people think, helping them see the humanity in those they've been taught to view as other. That's the battle that never ends, and it's fought with words, ideas, and persistent dignity in the face of indignity." In the decades since World War II, historians and military strategists have studied the Thornton method as an example of how psychological operations can exploit an adversary's cultural blind spots and ideological weaknesses. His techniques have informed modern counterintelligence training and highlighted the dangers of allowing prejudice to influence intelligence analysis. But perhaps the most powerful lesson from Robert Thornton's story is a simple human one. Dignity can be a form of defiance. By maintaining his humanity and intellectual integrity in the face of a system designed to deny both, he demonstrated a form of courage that transcends the battlefield, his weapons.